Today we're going to be looking at Gilded Age strikes, and strikes are what happens when workers turn against the factories that they work in. They either stop working altogether, they protest, and sometimes they even attack the factories that they were originally working in. So strikes are active decisions by workers to attack the means of productions that they previously were a part of. So if you think about the way that factories operated in the Gilded Age, obviously they were very large, they were noisy, they were extremely dangerous. If you look at the steel plants here, these are Bessemer furnaces. These temperatures in these areas got extremely high. People had to work at very, very fast paces. So these were not great places to work. Dangerous, fast-paced, a lot happening, and a lot of things that could go wrong. And also you weren't paid very well, which made it even worse. So if you look at the production line, as you begin to mechanize the means of production, the way in which each worker works is just on one part of producing something. So if you imagine the production of a car, for example, you might just be producing part of a section of the motor. You have no idea how that relates to the larger thing that you're creating. You're completely alienated from it. So Karl Marx, a famous economic theorist, talks about the alienation of labor. And so in answer to this question, what's the relationship between the factory worker and the product? There really isn't one, other than the only reason you're doing what you're doing is so that you can get paid. Now, one of the people who got involved in this was a guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor. And basically what he says is that you might have some sympathy with this. You know, if you're not really into what you're doing, you're going to try to do it as slowly as you can, to do as little work as you can, and to try to convince your employer that you're working hard, but really to not do that. So Taylorism, basically, what he does is he looks at model workers, people who were the best laborers, and he would time them and basically see how quickly they could do a task. And he would then use that time to force other workers to work at the same pattern. So people felt trapped in this way of literally being timed in the type of work that they were doing. So there was a lot of discontent, and this leads obviously to unionization. So laborers and workers are going to organize themselves into groups, and they are going to bargain for wages, and they're going to ask for higher wages and better working conditions too. Now, this is going to lead to some tension because eventually the workers are going to turn against the very companies that employ them. So this happens in 1877 in a railroad strike. And when I say, why would workers target the railroad? Well, first of all, it was the backbone of the American economy. And it was a symbol of corporate power and oppression of the workers because as many as 1 in 25 people worked on the railway. And after an economic crisis in 1873, there were a lot of people out of work. As much as 25% of the workforce wasn't able to find work. So what happened is you had something called the Great Railway Strike, or the Great Railroad Strike. So you had a financial panic, as I said, which resulted in a lot of people out of work. The companies then had to reduce wages and salaries in order to save money. Of course, the workers then found that intolerable because they couldn't manage, and the companies said they couldn't afford more, and the workers knew they could. So basically a general strike is when everybody in the industry stops working. So the railways literally stopped operating. And not only that, when the militias came in, when the state governments came in to send in troops, the workers went and turned against the railways to the point where they literally destroyed the trains themselves. And so these are people that were working on those trains that then destroyed them. And this is exactly this picture, which comes from the railway strike, could also be from a period right after the Civil War. This is what people did. They attacked railways as a way to attack the country. So this was seen as a very dangerous thing. And this led to a lot of violence in cities like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. So thousands of people were in the streets. There were shootings. There were attacks on railroads. This became very scary because it seemed like the country was coming out of control. Now, this was followed by another strike in 1886. Remember, the railroad strike was in 1877, so this is about 10 years later. And Haymarket, which is in Chicago, there was basically a meeting of workers who were very upset about the fact that a few days before some workers had been killed. They were also striking against their factory, in part because they were looking for an 8-hour day, and they were actually hoping for weekends, and they were asking for that, and they were in the streets in front of a plant, and a bunch of people were killed. There were 4 of them killed. So this was actually a rally in support of the working class, led by a group of German activists. And so most of the people in this crowd were non-English speaking immigrants who were speaking both in English and in German and asking for their rights. Now, this led to a lot of fear, and the police were called in sort of towards the end of the evening. Started to rain, so there weren't that many people left. But as you can see here, there's a guy up on the left talking about his rights and the importance of the working class. Well, somebody throws a bomb from behind that cart. And when I say somebody, it was one of the workers, and it prompted the police to start shooting. And it created a lot of violence, and 8 policemen were killed and 50 were injured. And this led to a bunch of people being tried. Most of them weren't even there that night. They were labor activists. So this led to the death sentence of 8 labor activists, and basically a tremendous fear, as was the case in the railway strike, that the working class was going to rise up and basically create havoc in the streets. And this was lead to kind of a revolution. So the Haymarket protest, as I said, here's the summary of it. Again, it's sort of like the 19th century 9/11, the fear of foreign radicalism. And this happens again a few years later in 1892, this time in Pittsburgh, and the Homestead strike was one of Carnegie's plants. Without going into too much detail, Carnegie was worried about the union activism in his plant, and this led to, again, here's the Homestead factory. There was a need to decrease wages. So you can see the call for the wage cut was the reason that the workers walked out. And when they walked out, they went on strike. And Henry Clay Frick, who was the manager of the factory, who not only called for the pay cut, decides to build a wall around the factory so that the people couldn't go to work. And he calls in a group called the Pinkertons. And the Pinkertons were a private police force. And they were made up primarily of Irish immigrants. Are you starting to notice a theme here? The first time there was the working class people in the railroad strike of 1877 were Irish. In the second case, in Haymarket, they were German. And here you have also Southeastern European immigrants, new immigrants who are working in this factory, who are now being policed by other working class immigrants who are Irish. So this leads to a full-on, basically a war between this police force, this private police force, which was hired by the factory itself, by Frick and by Carnegie. And you can see here, there's a war on the banks of where this factory is. And state militias called in. Frick is almost killed by an immigrant who goes in to try and confront him. So again, massive civil unrest. Finally, there is a strike, a Pullman strike, which brings us sort of back to the beginning. Once again, it's a strike against the railways. And Pullman was a guy who made those railway cars. If you've ever seen those old Western movies of people sitting in very luxurious railway cars, these were private railway cars which were built for the upper class. And the Pullman factory was actually not only a factory, it was also a town. So the people who worked in this factory and built these cars, there is a sleeping car, that's a Pullman car. That's named after the owner of this factory. And there's the factory town that you can see, and there's where all the workers lived. And they had to pay whatever rents that Pullman told them to. So what ends up happening here is there is an economic crisis, as there was in 1873. There's another one in 1893, and this happens routinely as the economy begins to grow. as speculation happens and as the economy begins to decline, you have profits declining. And when profits declining, you have to cut wages. That's how much you pay people. So when you cut wages, people say, well, I can't survive on that wage. And not only that, but Pullman also increased the prices of the rents of his houses in his factory town. And this led to another national strike. And this ultimately was broken up by the federal government when they sent in the troops to basically force the trains to keep operating. So this was a wildcat strike, which was basically people walking off the job. It led to a national strike, and eventually this strike was crushed by the federal government. So there were patterns here. And we'll talk about these patterns. But again, the Pullman response, as you can see, not only was there the breaking of the strike, but you'll notice that here there was the hiring of African-American labor, groups called scabs, and scabs are non-union labor that come in to replace the people that aren't working. And here, as I said before, the US government comes in, argues that the strike is illegal, says it's interfering with the trade because the mail was moved by railway cars. So what are the patterns here? Do the strikers get what they want? Well, in the first case, right, their wages stay low. In the second case, their leaders get executed, right, in Haymarket, that get executed. In the strike in Pittsburgh, you have the situation where the Pinkertons are called in, so they get beaten up and killed. So the workers don't get what they want. Race and ethnicity are always factors. In the first case, it's the Irish. In the second case, it's the Germans. In the third case, it's the Southeastern European immigrants. And in the fourth case, it's black scab labor that gets brought in to respond. So there are all these divisions within the society that get highlighted. The workers attack the factories of the railways. And generally the workers get badly treated. So at the end of the day, what do you learn here? If you're a worker, you learn that no matter how hard you work and no matter what you do, you're going to end up getting attacked by the government if you turn against the corporations. And if you're a corporation, you learn that the federal government is there to back you up if there's violence. So that's a lot of information, but hopefully you get some of the ideas here. And we'll hopefully have a chance to review it a little bit more in class.